Okay, hi. So this is emotions, and emotions are kind of an interesting thing, I guess, in psychology, and they tend to be, at least in the past, be very much kind of downplayed by psychology. There's a huge amount, as I'm sure, of research on cognition, on thoughts, on memory, language, that kind of stuff. Particularly looking at things like rationality, how we're able to make decisions, good decisions, how we're able to reason logically. But there's much less emphasis traditionally anyway, on emotions. Things are starting to change now, and we can start to understand the neurobiology of emotions and so on. But particularly with evolutionary psychology coming into the fray here, emotions are something which have been looked at by evolutionary psychologists who ask the ultimate question of why we have them. What is the purpose of emotions? So some of the things that are important and some of the things that we're talking about is briefly I'll try and describe what they are. The argument about whether emotions are universal. It used to be thought that um, emotions were kind of culturally constructed things which you learn or you acquire from your culture rather than having any kind of underlying evolutionary origins. Then I'll spend some time talking about the biology of different emotions and then some of the evolutionary functions of specific emotions and why it might be adaptive to show these emotions off. I asked this question in the lecture, why do we have why do we have emotions? And what we're looking for here is an ultimate explanation, which gives us the evolutionary benefit in terms of survival, reproduction, or child rearing, whichever one of those are. What are the benefits to the genes of wiring in emotions to the bodies that carry them? And one of the things that I discussed in the lecture is that many respects emotions are kind of a way of prioritizing what we do. Every animal needs to make a decision, which is what do I do next? And how does an animal determine what it does next? Am I going to eat? Am I going to forage for food? Am I going to search for a mate? Am I going to spend some time rearing children? Am I going to run away? Am I going to hide? That kind of stuff. And to a certain extent, those um, um, situations, what I do next is a kind of like a rational cognitive act. We look at the environment and we make certain decisions, but a lot of these decisions are prompted by emotions. So, for example, if we find that we're feeding and sometime a predator comes in, then the priority of feed suddenly gets pushed down the list, and the emotion of fear will shove a new priority at the top, which is get the hell out of there. And that emotion will lead to the so-called fight or flight response, which will lead to the organism disappearing. If an organism is feeding and it encounters some rotten food in the patch that it's foraging in, then that might invoke the emotion disgust. That goes to the top of the list, and that prevents or stops the animal from consuming the food, and then leads them to go somewhere else, etc., etc. So basically what emotions do is to tell you what is the most adaptive thing to do next. If it's to flee, then do that. If it's to feed, then do that. If it's to mate, then do that, and so on. So emotions generally prioritize what we do and tell us what to do next, given the situation. So they work in tandem with cognitions, okay, in order to the best enable the organism to make the best decision. This statement by Ness here, you can pause it if you want, I won't read it out, basically summarizes what I've just said in kind of more complicated language. It's about prioritizing goals so that the organism can increase adaptive behavior. In science fiction, quite often the science fiction authors and philosophers have explored whether emotions actually get in the way of human activity. In other words, they're a negative rather than a positive feature. And we can kind of think this, if only we didn't have our emotions, if only we didn't have our passions, if only, interfering with the way that we think about things, if only we didn't get angry, and instead of getting angry and banging our hands on the table and attacking somebody or shouting at somebody, we could adopt a cool response, think about what's the best outcome, and react according to that. And this is something which is explored in the character of Mr. Spock in Star Trek, who supposedly had no emotions. And the reason is if we didn't have emotions, how would we ever become motivated to do anything? It is things like a passion for an obsession with a particular activity, or whether it's a scientist who wants to find a cure for cancer or understand gravity, or a musician who wants to write a great work. It's our passions, our fears, our loves, and our hatreds that tend to motivate us to do things, because without the emotions motivating us to do things, without the passions and so on, we would just be cognitive beings who would not really be motivated to do anything. And the idea that Spock, although there was an attempt there to make Spock in the original series of Star Trek emotionless, Spock would quite often use the word fascinating. He was driven by interest. So even though Spock purportedly had no emotions, he did have emotions. He had the emotion of interest or fascination. That was what drove him on to do the things he did. So emotions are motivating factors. When Darwin first studied these in 1872, or wrote the book in 1872, he gave a lot of examples of the similarities between human and animal emotions. So the cat at the top on the right there is clearly feeling fear. The dog is adopting a subservient response. He's showing that whether it's his owner or his another dog, he's showing that he's recognizing the dominant position of that other animal. He's putting himself down, and that's the kind of thing we do when we feel sorry, when we're ashamed. We kind of put our heads down and look up and try to show to somebody that we genuinely feel the emotions that we're feeling. And at the bottom there is a character who is showing fear again, and these are all these three things are kind of manifestations of fear. Now, actually, faking emotions, trying to get somebody to pull a fear face, off the cuff, do look scared, is actually surprisingly difficult. So the way that these pictures were taken is a physiologist called Duchenne, a French physiologist, actually stimulated the facial muscles with electrodes. As we'll see later, it's very difficult to fake this kind of stuff in order to get the required emotional responses. And then if we go back here, they simply airbrushed out the electrodes, so we just end up with a face. So this is something which is probably pretty difficult to get through ethics nowadays. So there are these similarities, and Darwin's position was that there must be something universal, not just in the sense that humans all have fear, anger, sadness, guilt, and so on, but that there's a certain commonality across species. We can recognize fear in other mammals and possibly other non-mammals as well, because we all possibly share similar underlying neural circuitry to produce these emotions. This kind of view on the universality of emotion changed in the early 20th century when various people, including the behaviorists led by Skinner, who believed that emotions were simply the result of learning and could therefore be arbitrary. The fact that we all maybe pull the same face of sadness in a particular society is simply because we're all given the same model of what sadness looks like, and we've learned it like that, in the same way that we all speak the same language. There is nothing specifically universal about the English language or the French language, although Chomsky would argue that language itself was universal, but there's nothing universal about these particular languages. The reason people in an English-speaking country speak English is because the model that they've been given of language is English, and that's what they learn. And similarly, this is what Skinner would say about emotions. The cultural anthropologists actually went to study other peoples and other cultures, something that Skinner didn't do, and the prevailing view there was that emotion was something that was acquired by culture, from quote culture, and it was very cultural specific. It was essentially a cultural construct. So Margaret Mead, who studied people in Samoa, claimed that she found evidence that there was no such thing as sexual jealousy. People were free to have sex with who they wanted, and if you were with somebody and then had sex with somebody else, and the person that you were previously with wouldn't feel jealous about that. So this kind of idea that emotions are infinitely variable, vary from culture to culture. Some cultures have emotions that others don't have, and other cultures will will not have emotions that we have in our culture. For example, in sexual jealousy, and they might well have different emotions to us. The trouble with this point of view is really it was not properly, rigorously tested. And the guys at the bottom there, a team led by Paul Ekman, actually decided that what they would do is, let's go and see, because one of the important factors about culture is that not only do cultures have emotions, but cultures have different rules for displaying emotions. In some cultures in 20th century, 19th century Britain, there was the idea of a stiff upper lip where one shouldn't show one's emotions. One should, adopt a poker face, and if something bad happens, you kind of don't get sad, and if something that makes you angry, you try not to show your anger. So that's not saying that people don't feel them, it's just saying that there are certain rules about what is polite to express. In Japan, the expression of emotion is frowned upon, although not obviously publicly frowned upon, because that would be displaying an emotion. But whereas in some of the Romance countries, Italy, for example, particularly, emotional displays are much more encouraged. So these are the so-called display rules, the rules which say whether it is or isn't appropriate to display a particular rule. So Ekman essentially studied a bunch of people across the world, including people from Papua New Guinea. There were tribes who had very little contact with Westerners, and they presented these with the faces of Western people, more on that in a minute, displaying emotions, and the people were simply asked, the New Guineans were simply asked, what emotion is this feeling? What might have happened to this person? And so on. And they were also asked other questions, such as what kind of face would you pull if there was something terrifying happened, or what kind of face would you pull if somebody gave you a lovely spear for your birthday, or whatever. And what was found here is that there was remarkable commonalities. The New Guineans could identify the emotions in the faces of Westerners. The faces they presented to the different stimuli were similar to the ones that Westerners would pull, and Westerners could identify the emotions in the New Guineans. And the original research, Ekman showed that there were 6 basic kinds of emotions mediated by these 6 basic facial expressions. So we have here, from left to right, top to bottom, we have anger, fear, disgust, pleasant surprise, happiness, and sadness. So these are the basic 6 emotions. Now, that's not to say there aren't more emotions, but these are the basic 6 which could be best shown by facial expressions. So these are the basic 6, and this is the result of the cross-cultural work: fear, happiness, pleasant surprise, anger, disgust, and sadness, which is suggesting that there's an innate component, which is suggesting that possibly there's some kind of evolutionary reason for these emotions being displayed. More recently, Ekman has extended his work to show things like amusement, contentment, embarrassment, excitement, guilt, pride, and achievement, belief, all displayed by their own unique facial expression. So contempt and disgust are similar, but they are subtly different in the way that the face actually represents these emotions. These are not all of the emotions, of course. These are only the ones that are easiest, that can be displayed on the face. There are doubtless emotions such as things like interest, which is are much harder to display, particularly on a photograph. So these aren't all the emotions. These are just the emotions that Ekman has been able to elicit using facial expressions. So there's some evidence there that there is universality, not exactly the same from culture to culture. And remember, there are different display rules about the appropriateness of displaying emotion, but it is showing that both the emotions and the sadness and any expressions that accompany them have some probably innate basis, because everybody kind of tends to do the same thing. We single emotions conspicuously, and this is something of a puzzle, and there is no clear answer to why this is. This is actually a picture of Paul Ekman here, and you can see that on the left and the right there, the face on the right looks genuine, where the face on the left looks like he's faking the emotion of happiness. And the reason for that is that the regions around the eyes here are difficult to control cortically. The mouth can be controlled cortically, so in other words consciously, but these are hard to control. So when you try to fake a smile, often the eye regions don't wrinkle, and you can immediately tell that this person isn't particularly pleased to see you. This person is trying to fake the fact that they are trying to see you.